In today's episode, an amateur photographer purposefully sets off alone in the woods to photograph big game like moose and bears up close. As he sits still in the bushes, it isn't long before a 600-pound grizzly gets a little too close for comfort. His photographs of the bear capture the final moments before he's eaten alive. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying grizzly bear attack on Richard White. Welcome to Final Affliction. Richard White picked up an old camera at 15, and ever since then, he was hooked. Photography was his passion, and it's what drove him to learn how to rough it out in the wild. Before that camera, he'd never shown any inclination toward camping, hiking, or anything to do with nature. But that lens made the world come alive in a way that he'd never seen before. He never intended to make a living from it, but the passion kept him tethered, his mind healthy, and his mundane job at a pharmaceutical company bearable. As long as he could look forward to a camping trip planned on his calendar at all times, he was happy. Now at the age of 49, he'd long since graduated from going with hiking groups and camping with friends. He was happy enough to set out alone and disappear into the wilderness for a few days by himself. His wife and teenage daughter had gotten used to his absences every few months. Lucy, who was now 15, had started showing an interest in the lens too, and though she accompanied her father on short day trips around their home in San Diego, this trip wasn't one of those. Richard was going to Alaska's Denali National Park, and this 3-day expedition was a little too much for Lucy just yet. Not that Richard minded, he had a special place in his heart for Denali. He'd been there 3 times before, and to him, there was nothing quite like the silence and the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. This was also his last chance to visit the place before the deep Alaskan winter set in, leaving snow so deep that sections of the park closes down completely. September and August were the best times to come anyway. The animals scurried about in a last attempt to store food for the long winter ahead and to eat whatever greenery was left before the frozen wasteland took the last edible morsels away. Everything living was out and about. The bears, lynxes, bucks, squirrels, and everything, just waiting to be captured for eternity on Richard's memory card. Richard kissed his wife and daughter goodbye and set out for Denali. When he pulled in, he picked out a spot to erect his tent and loaded everything inside, his food, sleeping bags, and all. He wasn't planning on spending much time at the camp. The next 3 days he was going to be out taking pictures until the sun went down. The drive had been a long one, and he barely had enough time to get his tent set up before it got dark, but he still managed to take a few snaps of the sunset at least. The next morning, Richard wolfed down breakfast and set out with his camera around his neck and his backpack full of snacks and drinks. The morning began just as he'd planned. As the sun rose, the wilderness came alive. Both small and large animals came out in hopes of getting their paws on as much food as they could in a single day. By the time the afternoon came around, Richard settled next to a river beside a clump of willows for a bite to eat. Before long, a buck came out of the trees for a drink of water. Then the birds rose from the trees, and even a massive moose made an appearance. Richard knew that if he camped out here all day, he'd get more footage than most other places in the park. But he never expected to catch a glimpse of the majestic grizzly bear. To Richard's absolute delight, a half-ton male lumbered out of the thicket of willows. He headed straight for a clutch of berry bushes just 60 feet away from where Richard was sitting and began to pick them off with a surprising amount of finesse for such a large animal. As it picked the bush clean, Richard snapped one picture after the other, and he just couldn't believe his luck. The animal was now only 40 feet away and still blissfully unaware of Richard's presence. Richard assumed that it saw him the moment it came out of the trees, but that it was choosing to ignore him, sitting so still in the distance. He'd run across bears from time to time, and they'd always preferred to keep their distance all on their own. But when this specimen of a bear came into the 40-yard range, Richard became a little unnerved. He'd never been so close to a bear before, and he doubted that it would come so close to him voluntarily. But now Richard was stuck where he was. He didn't want to move and startle the creature, fearing that could set off an unprovoked attack. So he remained where he was, continuing to take pictures and hoping that it would venture off on its own when the bushes were finally cleared of food. Richard was right to be worried about the small distance between them. He made a slight adjustment to get his legs in a more comfortable position and accidentally crushed a cereal bar wrapper beneath his foot. The sound made the bear look up, just as Richard snapped a shot of it looking straight into the camera. It saw Richard and tentatively moved toward the strange creature that was so close. Another picture, this time only 35 yards away, and another at 30 yards. Then Richard's blood ran cold. It wasn't coming in to investigate anymore. The bear was now running straight at him. He dropped his camera, left his bag, and began to sprint toward the water. It was the only place to go. There was no outrunning the pounding paws behind his back. At least in the water, Richard might be able to swim faster than the bear. The sound of the bear's pounding paws behind him was now accompanied by the deep huffing of the massive animal's lungs. It was closing in. Richard pumped his legs harder than he thought was possible. He didn't take the time to look back. He knew it was nearly on top of him. The pounding and the breathing was now accompanied by an earth-shattering growl, and then his legs folded beneath him as half a ton of pure murderous rage descended on top of him. It was only then that Richard uttered his first scream. At the exact same time, the bear's enormous claws ripped through his jacket. The grizzly began tearing at his flesh and raking him across the ground in a full-blown attack. The birds took flight from the reeds as Richard's screams punctured the air. No longer satisfied with clawing at the man's back, the animal picked Richard up and threw him over, spinning him through the air. Richard's torn-up back hit the dirt. Before he could even comprehend what to do in this life-threatening situation, the bear was on top of him again. This time, a set of nails grabbed his head, tearing through his scalp and cheek, and its jaws clamped down on his neck and shoulder. Richard's neck broke almost instantly. He had a quick flash of the most blinding pain he'd ever experienced in his life before the world went suddenly dark and Richard was no more. In a lot of ways, Richard was lucky. At least his death was relatively quick, and he wasn't aware of the next 15 minutes of hell his body went through. The grizzly continued to shake and tear at Richard's body. It ripped off his jacket and shirt, slashed at his abdomen, and almost entirely tore his scalp away from his skull. When the bear had finally expended all of its energy, it dragged Richard to a cache just 200 yards away, leaving a trail of insides that spilled out of Richard's torn abdomen. There, it buried him beneath the rest of the food it planned on eating over the next few days. Only 2 hours later, a group of hikers came upon Richard's discarded backpack, camera, shreds of clothes, and enough blood and gore to make the scene look like something out of a slasher movie. They ran 3 miles to the nearest station, and helicopters and rangers were deployed before the sun even began to go down. They only had to follow the bloody trail a short distance to find Richard's remains. But the bear guarding it posed a serious problem. It ran off into the woods when they approached, but darkening skies made visibility almost zero, and the shots that were fired all missed. So they returned the next day. From the air, they could identify 5 separate bears, but it was the one who kept coming back to the cache wanting to attack them that was deemed the culprit. It took 3 shots to down the 600-pound full-grown grizzly. The necropsy quickly determined that he was indeed the animal who had been feeding on Richard, but it was the camera that held the most chilling details. Though never released to the public, the officers described it as 5 final photographs of the animal becoming aware of its watcher, and for those 5 frames, looking dead straight into the lens of the camera, it came closer and closer and closer, capturing the few seconds before Richard White met his terrifying final affliction.